And we are running tonight on a survival approach with Mr. Richard Scroggins from CentralTexasSurvival.com. Now, if you get the opportunity to go to Richard's site, have a look around. There's lots of great information, especially the information on the back pages or the archives. Have a look around. There's some great stuff up there. Good evening, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. How are you, Colin?
I'm excellent, sir. Thank you very much. I do appreciate you taking the time to come to us tonight. Richard, let's start by giving our listeners a little bit of your background. How did you come by all of these survival skills that you put up on your website?
Well, like I say on the website, it really started out as something I learned from my dad. My dad had been in the Army, and he had been stationed in Korea, and he wanted his sons to have the knowledge and ability to survive if something happened. And he was fond of saying when I was a kid that we needed to be prepared because one day we might be in the middle of the woods, get lost, and might need to be able to find our way out. So that got me started. And then I spent a few years in the military with what's called an AFSE in the Air Force of emergency management, specifically dealing with hurricanes and evacuation. Mm-hmm. Additionally, my grandfather was also a minister, and he studied prophecy and was interested very much in the end times and Revelation, and that got my interest piqued in end time study, and I sort of married the two throughout my life. And when I was doing research into survival early on, I found that there are a lot of people that talk about wilderness survival, and there are a lot of people that talk about end times, but you don't find too many people that marry the two, and that was sort of a gap for me, and that's why I started the website. But I've had a lot of experience. I was going to say,
are you still there?
In addition, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we just got to bounce on the link there, but go ahead, sir.
Okay. And then as well, I also worked for several years for an electric utility. So I had a lot of experience with grid, so that's why I also talk a lot on the website about grid failures, the state of the grid, power, backup issues, things like that.
Well, I'm most certainly pleased that you have that information under your belt, Richard. So accepting the premise that a disaster or a catastrophe is not an if, but a when, and kind of using the Katrina and New Orleans as a model of failure. We're aware the electrical grid system in North America is strained at best, and a number of issues could bring it down, as we saw a few years ago on the eastern seaboard. What immediate dangers do you see on the horizon regarding the electrical grid that would necessitate being prepared to lose power?
Well, it's not just theoretical. As a matter of fact, with the storm that just went through here in Texas, we had several days of mandatory rolling blackouts, especially in the big cities. I wrote an article about this. What's happened over the last few years in terms of the electrical grid is as we begin to rely more on technology, something that's called a SCADA system. It's an automated control system. We have begun to phase out some of the old manual switching equipment. And so what happens is if you have power failures that are large enough, everything relies on computer systems to control them. And in many cases, the reliance on computer systems is so heavy that the actual physical switches to reroute power no longer exist. And then you couple that with the fact that many power plants are getting rid of their small generators that are called black start generators. So we have very few black start power plants, and I'll explain that a little bit. What a black start is if you can think about it, it takes electricity to make electricity. So if you have a power plant, or say the entire grid goes down and you want to start the power up from the beginning, there's no power out there. You have to have some form of generation to get the first power plant started, and they have to be isolated from the rest of the grid. And once they're brought up, then you can begin to reconnect them to other power plants to bring them online. And these black start generators are not something that you just go down to Home Depot and buy. They're very large propane or natural gas power generators. So over the last few decades, especially in Texas and throughout the country, we've begun to phase out these black start generators and power plants that have the ability to black start. So we found ourselves in a situation that if we were to lose any particular grid, there's a tremendous amount of time that it will take to bring the power back online. One, because there are very few black start generating plants, and also because of the reliance on these computer control systems, these SCADA control systems. A lot of the manual switching that needs to be done to isolate the black start power plants and also to reconnect the grid will have to be done manually. And these crews could be in who knows what conditions, whether it be snow or rain or flooding, so it will greatly increase the time it would take to get the power back on.
Mm-hmm. And not necessarily the grid would come alive. It would take, we're not talking just turning a switch and everything comes back on. This could be days, weeks, even months before they could get enough of the grid up to sustain itself. Am I correct?
Well, yes, you are. And the reason is, again, because if the entire grid goes down, then you have to begin to first isolate the power plants that have the ability to black start. And then once they're up and running, then you can begin to interlink those power plants with other power plants. And then once all the power plants are powered up and running, then you can begin to give power back to the people, as it were, as you begin to build up the power on the grid.
Right, right. Now, you mentioned, you briefly mentioned that we are technologically driven now, computer-driven, if you will. And we have seen those stories over the last 6-7 months where people have actually got into the grid and hacked the grid and left little love notes and such. Is that a huge threat, or are they beginning to protect the grid against stuff like that?
Well, they're protecting it as best as they can, and there are rules in place, particularly in Texas. But it does happen. I've seen it firsthand. I worked at a utility in Texas that I won't name, and we did have our SCADA system hacked. So it does happen, and it can happen.
And of course, we saw up in Quebec, Canada, the winter storm that came through Quebec 2 years ago, literally knocked out the Quebec grid, which of course kicked down the line and bumped out New York, and it just kept going until almost hemorrhaged, until somebody found a way of stopping it affecting the Midwest. But we had a potential at that point in time of the whole grid collapsing from a winter storm, from ice on the major power cables. It was terrifying.
Yeah, it is. I remember that. And
yeah,
it's one of those things to where, we don't think that it can happen, but it happens on a small scale quite often.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the problem, is that we are not hearing all of what is happening. We hear the majors, but we do not hear the the daily incursions onto our grid system, which is, it is very pervasive. They have identified a number of countries that have been testing whether they can actually get into the system and manipulate it. And that's quite concerning, because if a terrorist ever did get onto our electrical system, they could shut us down in a matter of minutes.
Yes, they could.
Yeah, and of course that doesn't cover anything like earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, winter storms, and of course Apophis, this 390-meter wide asteroid that's going to make a close flyby in April 2013. Nobody has guaranteed that the gravitational pulls of this asteroid or its turbitude is not going to affect us, and we have seen over the last year the changes of the weather patterns, which is absolutely insane. Nobody can really judge what's going to happen tomorrow. And the electrical grid does seem to be the weak points of our system. We are so stuck with the system. Without electricity, can you imagine what North America would be like? What don't we use that involves electricity anymore? It's insane. Even down to our toothbrushes, for goodness sake.
Well, our entire society revolves around electricity. We need it. It's identified in terms of, I can remember when we were doing the disaster recovery planning after 9/11, the U.S. government began to prioritize all of the utilities. And of course, electricity was the number one priority. We don't think about this. In other words, we have electricity and we take it for granted. And we don't think about everything that it impacts. And in other words, you think about it, your car runs on gasoline, but you can't run the pumps to pump the gasoline if you don't have electricity.
Exactly.
And if you can't pump the gas, you can't run the trucks that deliver food. And given the fact that the average store only keeps about 3 days' worth of food, if you can't bring in new supplies, pretty soon the stores run out of food. So very quickly, it can devolve.
Yeah, they run out of, they do.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a common saying among survivalists and in the community is that we're essentially 9 meals away from anarchy. And that comes from the fact that the stores only keep about 3 days' worth of food. And when that runs out, if there's no resupply, there's no more food.
And also take into account that many of these stores are storing whatever supplies they do have in massive cooling fridges and refrigerators. And, of course, without electricity, there's a show on the History Channel up here in Canada, Earth After Man or something of that nature, where it shows where men no longer exist, there's no power. And it shows you how fast the supermarkets and the food stores, how fast the food rots. And funnily enough, the only thing that survives for about 50 years are Twinkies. So anybody out there that likes Twinkies, it's always something to stock up on, because even though they have probably 0 calories or 0 nutrition, Twinkies will last 50 years apparently. So, you know, a Twinkie will be the only thing left on Earth, and that's kind of a scary thing. I was watching Fox News and also NASA the other night, and they showed the Temple 1 asteroid. This thing is 3.7 miles wide, 6 kilometers. It has an orbital period of 5.5 years around our solar system. It's made one trip around the sun since the deep impact visit in 2004. And it's coming back, and they just sat a camera on that about 100 kilometers away overnight and took some photographs of Temple, and also of the Apophis. And absolutely fantastic to see what they're doing. But my gut instinct tells me they're testing for something that's incoming at a later date, possibly Planet X, Nibiru. But I can't see them going into that far deeper space if they don't think something is on the way in.
Well, I would tend to agree. And that's why, you know, from the standpoint of a survivalist, to me, regardless of what the threat is, the preparation is essentially the same. And something I wanted to say, to revisit what we were talking about, you talked about Katrina earlier. When Hurricane Ike hit Texas, I know that wasn't the same scale as Katrina. It was pretty devastating for this area. And I was with the National Guard team that went into Ike after the aftermath. I was down there for about 3 weeks in Galveston, and there was a tremendous loss of life, even though it wasn't on the scale of Katrina and Rita. And we had staged a few days before landfall, and then we went in immediately after the landfall. And on our way down there, we were, of course, in a military convoy, and you have to make periodic stops. And you would not believe the number of people, not only in vehicles but also on foot, every time that we would stop would come, you know, at us basically asking, you know, do you have any food? Do you have any water?
Right.
You know, we're out of food, we're out of water, we're waiting for the government response. And they look for any government outlet, be it military or police or anything, to help with the supply of food and water.
Yeah, and that's exactly what happened with New Orleans. They anticipated that there would be a police service to get them through, and that there would be emergency management. And unfortunately, it just wasn't there. And when it wasn't there, the poorer section of New Orleans that didn't have the opportunity to stock up and plan were left sitting on their roofs begging for rescue. And this cannot happen again. In a nation, 2 nations like Canada and the United States, with the affluence that we have to be prepared. We have to be prepared, as Baden-Powell said, for almost anything. We have to be prepared. And that's basically what tonight's show's all about for all of our people down in the virtual studio. We do appreciate you being down there, by the way. It's great to see you typing your faces up in the virtual studio room. And all of those people that are lined up as guests, if you could take the time to register as a listener with BTR, we certainly would appreciate it. It is not mandatory, but it does allow you to interact with the virtual studio and also interact with the show. I tell you what, Richard, let's take a quick break. When we come back, let's get into the meat and potatoes as you would say, about what somebody would need in their house to protect them and help them survive a disaster or a catastrophe. How does that sound?
Okay.
Okay, hang in there, sir. And we will be right back in a couple of minutes. So here's your first pee break for the night, because it does go back quite a ways, and there's a whole whack of interesting stuff out there. Now, Richard, before we get to the basic staples of what would be required in a home to survive, there is a statement down in the virtual studio about guns being legal or illegal. But if you get to the point of a cataclysmic event, I wouldn't think being able to produce a license for your firearm would be the greatest of your concern.
Yeah, I seriously doubt it at that point. But you have to understand that guns do play into this, regardless of your political stance on them. In Katrina and Rita, there were a lot of citizens that were armed and, of course, shot at police and shot at other homes. So there is an element of defense. Survival is a multi-layered prospect. So defense definitely comes into that. Of course, I live in Texas where we like our guns regardless. But in a survival situation, no joking, it is a necessity to defend what you have. Of course, we would hope that people would prepare enough to be of a mind to be able to help others and to feed others. But if you can't prepare enough to feed yourself, you're certainly not going to be able to help other people. So the more prepared you are, the better your chances of survival and those around you.
I agree 100%. I live in Canada where guns are absolutely taboo, according to the government, but I can attest to the fact that if it hit the fan, I'm about 7 minutes away from a cache of firearms that I would be able to defend myself and others with, if required, with the training to be able to do so. So I'm not too concerned regarding that as far as legal or illegal is concerned. If it's hit the fan, the police have got a heck of a lot more worrying to do than dealing with somebody that is permitted or not. I do happen to carry a permit, but that's beside the point. So let's look at the staples that we should have at home. Let's go for a week or a couple of weeks in our minds, although it could be a protracted experience. But I was reading on the emergency sites that 7 gallons of water per person per week. That's a gallon a day. That's a bare minimum that is required for each person in the household. That seems to be a lot of water, but when you think about it, we do use water for a lot of things.
Yeah, so you use water not only for hydration, but also a part of that number includes some basic or occasional hygiene, brushing your teeth and those sorts of things. The human body can survive on about a pint of water a day for a short period of time, but you need more than that over a long period of time. Especially depending on the temperature, your body can consume up to 3 gallons a day if it gets hot enough. But what I wanted to do is break down, when we talk about the basics of survival, just real quickly, if you haven't heard, there's something that we call the rule of threes in survival, and that breaks down our priorities. So that says that the human body can live for 3 minutes without oxygen, 3 hours exposed to harsh elements, 3 days without water, and about 3 weeks without food. So we prioritize, obviously, in most situations we're going to have oxygen, so that doesn't become a primary concern, although ventilation does. If you're a diehard survivalist and if you're housing yourself underground, ventilation is extremely important. So of course you've got to worry about that. You've got to be in a ventilated area. It takes about 3 cubic feet of air per minute to sustain the human body, and up to 10 cubic feet per minute if the temperature is hot enough. But the next priority is, of course, water. The body can go for several weeks without food, but you've got to have water. If it's hot enough, you can die without water in a matter of hours. So you've got to have water. Like you said, at least a gallon a day per person. More is preferred if you can get it. And then, of course, you want food. There are several different ways that you can store food. Canned goods is good. They have an extremely long shelf life. There are several varieties of powdered foods that you can get, like Mountain House or Augustin Farms make these. You can get dry products what I do is we get buy rice and cornmeal and things and vacuum seal those with an oxygen absorber in Mylar bags and seal that just like they would commercially. But one thing I wanted to note too on canned goods, when you talk about food storage, one advantage that a canned good has for certainly for short term for food is that it does contain both food and water. Your canned goods are, say if it's beans or corn or something like that, it's canned with a lot of water. So in an emergency situation, if you've got canned goods, that can has food and water. So you get so it's sort of a 2-in-1 package. But what you have to do too is you have to sit down and think about how much food you're going to need. For long-term sustainability, the human body needs to get at least 1,200 calories a day, and that turns out to be, say, 1 can of beans and about 1.25 cups of cooked rice per day per person will provide you with that minimum of 1,200 calories a day. And if you can throw in, say, an energy bar for breakfast or something, that helps you kind of to sustain or get over that 1,200 calorie mark.
So you would advise that cans of beans, rice, and energy bars would be the bare minimum of a sustainable 1,200 calorie diet.
Yeah, beans are good because in terms of canned goods, they're cheap. Beans and rice together make up a complete protein that the body needs. Very few foods, or at least without meat, give the body complete proteins, but beans combined with rice do. And basically rice is stored in a very small area, and basically it can be vacuum packed and it cooks to double the size. So rice is good. It's hearty. And what you have to think about too is that harder grains have a better storage. Softer grains like cornmeal that's already processed or flour are more susceptible to infestations of bugs like weevils and things like that. So your harder grains are good. And someone had mentioned peanut butter. Peanut butter is good. It provides a lot of nutrition. Just a few spoonfuls of peanut butter provides a lot of nutrition and calories. And that's really what it's about in a survival situation, is getting calories. In a normal day-to-day setting, you wouldn't think about eating something like Crisco or vegetable oil. But in a survival situation, it has a lot of calories. And that's really the name of the game. The end of the day in survival is getting your body with the calories that it needs.
Yeah. Now, with rice, of course, you'd have to rehydrate that, or you would have to you would have to soften it up somehow or cook it somehow. So you would require water for that, would you not?
Yes, you would require water for that. And you're going to require a heat source to cook rice. However, with rice and beans, you can put it in water and leave it for about 12 or 14 hours, and it does become edible. So many of these grains will hydrate without heat. Remember, heat is a catalyst for chemical reactions. So heat just, for the most part, speeds up that process. They will absorb the moisture if given enough time. But these are the sorts of things that you have to think about. If you're going to want to cook food, you're going to need a heat source, and that requires fuel.
True. Now, the one thing we do want to remind people that if we do have a cataclysmic event and you have no heat, no light, no power, for the love of God, do not bring your propane barbecue inside the house to cook. Do not do it under any conditions, because you will kill yourself. And we have seen it happen a number of times.
Yeah, you don't want to cook with anything that's going to put off fumes or smoke or anything like that. So if you can't cook with your natural, what you normally have, in other words, a lot of people that live in rural areas have propane that's connected externally to the stove, or in disasters, a lot of times the pressure in the natural gas lines is enough to continue to run the stove for a few days. Also, there are other alternatives that don't put off fumes. There are small alcohol stoves that you can buy. There are survival fuel canisters that you can get. Basically, you certainly wouldn't want to deal with any kind of wood flame or anything like that unless you had the means to operate it like a wood stove. So
right,
if
right.
you can
Now, go ahead, sir. Sorry.
I was going to say now, the best is if you can cook with some means that's already there, your existing stove, or prepare your meals without cooking if you don't have that means. Like I said, your rice and beans will absorb water over time. You can prepare that the night before so that it's edible the next morning. Your canned goods don't need to be necessarily cooked. However, I do want to also throw one caveat out there. A lot of people use home canned foods, can up their own foods. One thing that you have to be aware of is that there's always a risk of botulinum toxin with any home canned foods. So you really are supposed to bring your home canned foods at least to a boil for a few minutes before you eat them. You don't have to worry about that with commercially canned foods. But if there are people out there that are preparing and are preparing their own home canned foods, you do have to think about that.
Yeah, you do have to it's called pasteurizing, isn't it? You do have to pasteurize it.
Well, you do that when you do the initial canning process, but even afterwards, if it's a home canned food, you have to bring it up to the boiling temperature for a few minutes before you consume it, just to eliminate all risk of food poisoning.
Right, right. So, water purification tablets, are they easily purchased? Are they cheap? And would they be a good thing to be putting into this kit?
Yes, they are. Water purification tablets are good. You can use iodine, and you could also purify with just standard bleach. You want to make sure that you don't get any sort of scented bleach, but a few drops of bleach will purify water. There are also some methods described on my site for filtering water. You can buy commercial filters, and you can also filter water with sand and charcoal if you're in a situation where you're in the wilderness and you've had a fire and you've got charcoal and, of course, sand nearby. You can filter your water that way and make it drinkable if you don't have the means to boil it.
Gotcha. Now, with these, obviously, the water that you would be stocking takes you for as long as it will take you. I mean, people try and economize, but I'm quite sure that it would not take long under our normal consumption to go through a whack of saved water. So the water purification tablets would be good if you were taking water from streams, rivers, natural wells, and the like. So basically any water source that's available. You are going to need to go foraging for water. So you would need some kind of a water carrying system other than what you would have at the house. You could fill up your bathtub, but that's only going to give you X number of days of water. But you would need to be able to pack, if you will, a water source from one place to another. Are there bags out there in the emergency survival kits that permit you to carry liquids like that?
Yes, there are. There are a number of plastic bags that you can get. They're the hard, like a vinyl plastic with a spout. They come in, up to 5-gallon sizes. There are also, I've got some plastic jugs that are similar to like a gas can, but they're made specifically for water. You can carry in that. So then you can bring that back to the house and purify it. And there are several other techniques that you need to use when you procure your water. It's best to filter your water with at least some rudimentary filter when you're getting the water. Even straining the water that you're getting through a cloth or a T-shirt can help to weed out any solids or large debris. So you wouldn't want to filter it, say, through a fabric or a T-shirt first, and then if you could even make an on-site sand filter at the location, filter through the sand, that will help get out as much bacteria and debris as possible. Again, if you're in a situation where there's fire, if you can use charcoal. Basically, charcoal is an excellent filter material. They even use it today in modern filtration systems. You'll find activated charcoal. Charcoal is very porous and collects even down to the level of bacteria. So charcoal is an extremely good filter for water.
True, and it also makes a great camouflage for the face. But also, while we're talking about the food, also remember for all of those people out there that have pets, remember you have to feed them too. You cannot expect them to eat what you are eating, so you must make a contingency to feed those pets. And God forbid that you'll end up eating them, but you must feed those pets. So you also have to take that into consideration when creating an emergency kit. Now, of course, first aid kit is obviously a priority that you definitely need, because there's going to be no emergency assistance. There's going to be no 911 as such.
Exactly. So you need a good, well-stocked emergency kit, first aid kit. You need more than just what comes in your average kit. You need also a book that basically, if you can keep a book on either military emergency medical procedures or some sort of first aid manual, so that you're not going just off of your memory. There are a lot of good books that can show you how to on doing minor first aid, even up to surgery if it's necessary. Keeping supplies, that's something that, you know, the federal government probably doesn't like us to talk about, but there are a lot of drugs like, or even, you know, say antibiotics that you cannot acquire without a prescription, but you can get at your local feed store that are sold for animals, but are in fact the same exact chemical. Like in terms of antibiotics, you can buy oxytetracycline for pigs and cows. It's the exact same formula that's given for humans. And in a world where debris is floating around and perhaps disease is rampant, the need for antibiotics is going to be high. So, you know, I would stock up on antibiotics as well as your standard things that come in a first aid kit, such as, you know, anti-clotting agents, bandages, wraps, and those sorts of things.
Right, and as well as your own prescriptions for whatever ails you, and non-prescription medications is always a good thing to have in your first aid kit, because you never know when you're going to need them. As well as take a first aid course with the Red Cross, and keep current on the abilities of the Red Cross and first aid specialists. I hold a ticket as an emergency medical responder, so I have to recertify every 6 months. And believe me, the information I had 3 years ago compared to the information I have today is night and day. That's how much it changes on a continuous basis. So people out there, make sure you've got a first aid certificate, or at least a basic understanding of the human body and its interaction. Because without that, if you get yourself a wound and you do not treat it properly, by the time you realize you have trouble, you could be almost dead. And that's always a consideration. So make sure your first aid is up to date, people out there, even if you never use it. And it may not be you. It may be your friend down the street, or your sister, brother, mother, child, your grandparents, anybody, or your animals who you are trying to keep alive. So first aid is a very, very important issue here. And let me tell you a quick story, Richard. I think you'll get a kick out of this. It's a little off the beaten track, but it comes back to survival. I was 7 years old, and I was angry at my parents. So I grabbed a couple of cans out of the cupboard and threw them in a bag, and I told my mom and dad I was leaving home and I was done. I was going to go join the circus or whatever. And I took off, and they let me go. And I went off to my secret little place in the woods, and I sat there for about an hour and a half, and I started to get hungry. And I opened up my bag, and I pulled out those cans, and then I suddenly realized I didn't have. I went home. So make sure, with all of these cans of beans that you're going to stock up on, you actually have a manual can opener, not an electric can opener, a manual, old-style camping can opener, because you'll starve to death if you don't.
Yep.
And flashlight batteries, that's another thing we need, right?
Yep, you need flashlights, batteries, extra batteries, anything that you would use. People don't think about this. You know, in a survival situation, you're going to be consuming food, but then you're also going to be getting rid of it as well. So you have to have extra toilet paper and the normal necessities that maintain, you know, life, your lifestyle, what you use.
Exactly.
So lots of things that you have to think about, and it's the good idea if you can, you know, get these things ahead of time. Do a little bit of practice, do some mock drills. I know in the in emergency management and disaster recovery, we do semi-annual drills, and you learn from practicing what you don't have and what you need.
Right. And it's amazing as we build the list, of course, lights and matches, something to cause fire.
Yes, matches are good, and what you can do is, if you can, acquire waterproof matches. If you can't, if you've got a candle, you can light a candle and wait till the wax begins to build up, and you can dip traditional matches in the wax and make your own waterproof matches. Another thing to think about is, if you're going to buy matches, do your best to buy strike anywhere matches, because a lot of the matches that are sold today require that you have the box that they come in to strike them. That's a safety feature, but if you have the matches and you lose the box, the matches are no good without the box. So try to acquire strike anywhere matches.
You know what, that's a fabulous thought, because I hadn't even considered that. Of course, you need the little striker on the side to make, and that's the only thing that's going to fire those. I've tried lighting those without the striker, and it's no fun at all.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, also, if you're in a house setting, I was told a long time ago to make sure that you have some tools, wrenches to shut off water and gas supplies. You know, if there's a gas rupture, or you know, you need to be able to manipulate whatever utilities that you have left, and you may need to repair something. So make sure you have the basic tool system in place too.
Yes. Yeah, you need.
So.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking, you know, the more you think, the more you need. And I'm thinking disposable cups, plates, and utensils, so you conserve water. So you don't, you know, I'm a bachelor. I don't like to wash up, and I think paper plates and throwaway cups and that is absolutely a fabulous, ingenious idea.
Yeah, and what you can do is, if you stock up on canned goods, you can open the can, you eat the food, you drink the water, and then you throw away the can, and there's no plate or anything like that.
There you go.
So that's a way.
That's another way. So, again, don't use any indoor or outdoor grills. You know, you can get carbon monoxide poisoning with that in a heartbeat. So keep those out of the house. Now, they talk about using a regular phone system rather than cell phones, because obviously cells are going to be out. But I believe that the phone system would probably also be out, would it not? Or does that run on a different current system?
Well, yes, it will be out, and yes, it does run on a different system. So what happens is, your phone is powered from the central office. And if you have a standard power outage, say, you know, I'm out at my house and a tree falls on a line and I lose power, but the phone office does not, well, then my phone will stay up because it's powered from the other end. But if it's a large enough power outage that the central office is affected, then, of course, all the phones will be dead. And that's why a lot of times you'll have a localized outage. You pick up the phone, it still works. And we get in that mindset that we think, well, the phones worked the last time we had a power outage, it'll work the next time. Well, if the outage is large enough, the phone, it won't work. And we get in these thought processes, just like the water. A lot of survivalists and people that are preparing think, well, I'll store up food, and people neglect water because we think of water as being free from the tap. You go to the tap, you turn it on, you get water. It's always there. And so you have to think that there's a possibility if the power goes out, it won't be there. It'll be there for a little while because water works a little bit different. You've got pressure in the line, but when that pressure runs out, the water won't be there.
Right, exactly. And down in the virtual studio, they're talking about bug-out bags, jump kits, as we call them in Canada. And we will get to that in just a few minutes. We're going to switch over from the house setting to when you're out in the wilderness, what are you going to do? Because you don't have all of these abilities to store food. You're running pretty thin on the ground. So we will get to that in the next half an hour. So you people down in the virtual studio, thank you for reminding me. Hang in there and don't go away. We will get to that. Before we close out this segment, Richard, crank radios, how efficient are they? These hand crank radios and hand crank flashlights, are they a good thing to have, or do they create more energy than they're worth?
Well, hand crank radios and flashlights work pretty good. I've got several. And, you get, about a minute of cranking will get you a few minutes of power. Of course, the radios take more energy than the lights do. But you have to be careful. Some models are more robust than others, but they do work. It's a technology that's been around for a long time. The crank radios have been used in the military for decades, so they do work. They are good. but, you know, you need to, don't put all your eggs in one basket. It's a good thing to have a flashlight that runs on batteries, and it's a good thing to have a crank flashlight. If one fails, you've got the other one as a backup. But they do work. It's an old technology. It's proven, and they do work.
Right.
And
right. Now, go ahead. Sorry, I lost you on the bounce there. Try again.
I was going to say, and again, I know you're talking specifically about the emergency radios that receive weather, and like they are good. There are also some crank radios for two-way communications. I know we're not specifically talking about those, but if you have those, you have to remember that most of those are for very short-range communication. Now, the weather radios are good. They can pick up the signal from a long way away. Right.
Now, if a catastrophe hits, does the government have a shortwave system that activates that? If you had a shortwave receiver that you could listen to emergency broadcasts, is the government equipped with anything like that in North America?
Well, yeah, you do have the emergency system that will come out on all the participating radio waves. What they also do here in North America is, if you're familiar, we have the CB radio or Citizens Band, and channel 9 is used for emergency communications. So there's a method of sending emergency over the Citizens Band radio, as well as we have what are called ham radio operators, and one of their auxiliary functions is to transmit emergency messages over shortwave.
That's true. CQ, CQDX, CQDX. Oh, yeah, I remember the shortwave very well in the emergency systems. And while you mentioned Citizens Band Radio, there's an organization out there by the name of REACT, R-E-A-C-T, REACT, an absolutely fabulous emergency service that works on Channel 9 on any Citizens Band radio throughout North America. If you get yourself in trouble on the highway, you switch over on Citizens Band to Channel 9, and call for a REACT operator, and there is a good darn chance that that operator will be able to come back to you and help you with your assistance. I tell you what, Richard, this is a great place to take a break. We're at the top of the hour. When we return, let's look at survival in the wilderness and, of course, hunting challenges. And that should get everybody all tweaked up. What happens if you're out camping and suddenly it hits a fan and you can't go home? What are you going to do? So, Richard, should we find ourselves in a wilderness emergency survival situation, what are the survival basics? What should we be immediately concerned about if we know we can't go back to civilization?
Well, I was out in the wilderness this past weekend, and it got down to 26 degrees, so I was thinking a lot about warmth. But in all seriousness, the first thing out of the gate is, when you're going anywhere where there's a possibility that you could walk off the trail, you're going to be in the wilderness, you're going to be alone, the first thing you got to do is tell your friends and family when you're leaving, where you're going to be, and when you expect to get back. Because if nobody knows that you're lost, then there's no one to send the search party. And considering that for the average person, after a very short period of time, you begin to get hungry and tired, the quicker the search and rescue is on the way, the better. That's the first thing.
Okay. Now, you're in Texas, and you say it's going down to 6 degrees?
No, it was 26. 26.
That's 6 degrees Fahrenheit, right? 26,
no, 26
sorry, 26.
Fahrenheit. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, we had gotten a little bit. I'm saying we had gotten a little colder the weekend before. We had some snow down here, but I didn't happen to be out that weekend, so.
Right. Well, just for the people in the virtual studio, I typed in our current temperatures here in Calgary, and tonight it is minus 6 degrees Celsius, and it's going down to minus 16 degrees Celsius and minus 18 degrees for Thursday. So we're going cold. We just came out of a warm spell, which was plus 4, plus 5 degrees Celsius. So extrapolate what you're telling me, Richard, and put it into those temperatures for Canadians in winter or the Midwest in winter, and you have trouble in River City without heat. So fire, shelter, water, and food, I guess, are the main staples. Am I correct?
Yes. So like we said, if we go back to our rule of 3, we said after oxygen, we could die of exposure to the elements in as little as 3 hours. So in that case, so we prioritize, we say we have oxygen, water is further down the list, so our number one concern is protection from the elements. So it's fire. So basically, what you need to do is you need to know several ways to produce fire, and you need to carry at least one or two methods of fire production on your person at all times, and especially if you're in a situation where you could walk off the trail. So that means waterproof matches, a lighter. What I carry at all times on my person is something called a ferrocerium rod, and that's basically a man-made flint, and it has a little magnesium mixed in with it, and it's formed into a hard rod, and you can strike that with a knife or a rock and produce very hot sparks.
Oh, okay.
So those are sort of some of the modern things that you can take with you. Myself, I'm practiced at making fire in many primitive methods, including friction fire and flint and stone, but most people don't have those abilities. And if you're not practiced in that, you're not going to get a fire from rubbing two sticks together with no prior practice. It's very difficult. It takes a long time to learn it and to perfect it. So the best way is to make sure that you have some modern means of fire production with you at all times. If you do happen to get out into the wilderness, you don't have any modern way of producing fire, your best bet is to go with a bow drill method, a primitive fire making method. And what you do is you're going to take a shoelace or some piece of string that you have. You're going to take a stick that has a normal bent bow shape, and you're going to tie that string between it kind of loosely. And then you're going to try to find some wood that's not rotten, but beginning the rotting process, because it has to be solid enough to work with, but it also has to be at a certain level of decomposition so that the ignition point is lowered. You want a wood that will ignite at around 300 to 400 degrees, and that takes a little bit of decomposition to do that. And then what you'll do is you'll cut yourself a small cylindrical piece of wood, maybe 6 or 7 inches long. You'll then take a flat piece of wood that we call the hearth, and you're going to cut a small cylindrical hole in it and in a place to the side to catch a spark. And then what you'll do is you'll find a stone or another piece of wood that you can apply pressure to the piece of wood that's cylindrical. We call the spindle. And then you're going to wrap your string around it and work the bow back and forth until the wood gets hot enough to produce an ember. You can look at, there's YouTube videos that show you how to produce this. It can be done. It's difficult, but if that's your last-ditch method, that's the easiest way to do it in the wild. But your best bet is to always carry a means of producing fire with you. And that's
right.
The number one thing, is to be able to produce the fire.
Okay, so first of all, I would think that as you're producing the fire, then you would take an inventory of everything on your person so that you know what you have with you. And hopefully you have packed the right stuff at the right time. Obviously, you need some form of cutting tool, a knife or a hiker's axe or something of that to be able to shape and manipulate wooden limbs of trees and what have you, because you need to build a shelter. Am I correct? This would be your second requirement, is to find somewhere comfortable, warm, or as comfortable and warm as possible, where you can maintain your body heat and protection.
Yeah. So what you want to do is, if you can find some sort of a natural wind block, okay, fallen over tree or something like that you can begin to build your shelter around. Of course, you'll want to use whatever is available. If you can cut down some tree limbs, or if there's some that are dead. Basically, the first thing is you've got to produce protection from the wind. It'll help you build your fire, and it'll cut down that wind chill factor. So you've got to get that down. Then you're going to want to build your fire in a method to where that heat will reflect off of some backing material, wood or stone, and then direct the heat from that fire towards your body. So what you'll see a lot of times, people will surround the fire with stones. The stones absorb that heat and then radiate it. And definitely you're going to have to take an inventory of what you have. So this depends on what our immediate need is. If it's so cold out there that we're going to die, We've got to get some shelter, and then we've got to get some fire. And then we can begin to assess what we have and start deciding on whether we're going to wait in place for rescue or if we're going to have to do a self-rescue and get out of there. And there's a few things, staples, that you need to have to affect either rescue by search and rescue team or on your own. So if you're building a survival kit for the wilderness, you do need a few things. So like you said, you need a means of producing fire. You need something to keep warm with, like a space blanket. You need a knife to cut with. If you can, you need rope. Parachute cord is thin and strong. You can carry that. If you're going to be rescued by search and rescue, you need a means of signaling, so a whistle or a mirror that can be shined at an approaching helicopter or plane. Those sorts of things you need to have in your pack. And if you got room, a few emergency bars don't hurt either.
Right. And I think it goes without saying that even in an emergency situation out in the wilderness, it is vitally important that once you have your fire and your shelter, keep calm. The fire will give you a psychological contentment, if you will. It's one of the basic staples to settle a person's spirit. But keep calm, stay level-headed. Don't allow your fears or your non-knowledge to get carried away. In other words, don't try and trek out of a place where there's nobody around for 25 miles unless you have no other alternative but to head in that direction, correct?
Exactly. So you've got to calm down. You've got to address the needs in the hierarchy. So in other words, you've got to get your heat, you've got to get your shelter, and then you can begin to assess what you need. If it's water, food procurement is actually pretty far down the list. Like we said, human body can go for several weeks without food, so water becomes very important. But if it's cold enough that there's snow and stuff on the ground, water procurement is a little more easier, although you need to make sure you see people on TV eating snow and things like that. You don't want to do that. When you eat snow, it actually cools the core of your body down way too fast. You don't want to eat snow. You want to let it melt to as close to room temperature as you can before you consume it. You don't want to consume cold snow. But once you get a few of those basics, then you can begin to formulate a plan. You can see what you have in your gear or in your pack. Hopefully you've got a 1 or 2 day supply of stuff that you took camping with you. Then you can begin to address moving, because chances are you're probably going to need to move at least some distance. So if you're planning on waiting for rescue, you're going to need to get into some sort of a clearing or an opening. So after you've survived that first night and you've stayed warm, and basically with not just your shelter, but remember that anything that you can get to insulate yourself, leaves, if it be pine limbs, any limbs and needles, you want to lay those down to sleep on, as well as cover yourself up with, insulate from the ground and then insulate from a bug. But when you survive that first night, then you have to formulate a plan. Like I said, you're probably going to have to move either to find an opening where you can be seen by search and rescue, or walk your way out. So you've got to determine where you're at. So you need to know beforehand going into an area, you need to know relatively where it is. You need to know relatively where the close highways and towns are, so that when you get your bearings, you determine where your directions are, the cardinal points, north, south, east, and west, that you'll have a general direction to go. I've got some posts on how to find your direction if you don't have a compass at my website. So once you do that, then you can begin to you decide whether you're going to stay or go, and then get your way out. Hopefully, you'll walk in a downhill direction, find a stream, and walk out along that stream if you decide to self-rescue.
Exactly. And if you do need to waterproof your shelter, people don't realize, but good wet clay or mud is always lather that on the roof, on the limbs and the boughs and the leaves or whatever it is you're using to cover the roof of the shelter with. Wet clay or mud is a great waterproofer. It won't last long, but it will last you long enough to get you through a rainy night or what have you. Now, in a desert emergency situation, of course, that's a totally different thing. You have to get the moisture from the night dew, and that's a totally different set of circumstances. You need to stretch out a tarp of some kind to catch that dew, and you'd have to collect it before sunrise because it would be gone pretty darn quick, I would think.
Yeah, so, that's one thing that's suggested to keep in a survival kit as well is plastic or plastic bags. There's a couple of things that you can do. Of course, a lot of people have seen where you can, you can lay out a plastic tarp and weight it down with, dig a hole and weight it down with a rock, and you'll collect the dew. You can also take a piece of plastic and wrap it around a tree limb and tie it off, and the moisture from that tree will basically come out and fill the bag. There are a couple of different methods that you can use to get water. You can also dig with it if you can find what looks like an old stream. If you'll dig in the bend of the stream, that tends to hold water longest. You can dig for water. Of course, now there's always everybody talks about, well, you can cut open a cactus and you can get water. It's true and it's not true. Some cactuses are produce water. Others are poisonous. There are also plants that look like cactus and are not. So you need to avoid that if you can.
Right. And of course, just going back to the forest setting or the camping setting. Whatever you do, people out there, I don't know where this legend came from, but don't eat mushrooms or fungus. There's a couple of reasons for this. First, mushrooms have little or no caloric value, none. They burn more energy eating and digesting than they do give you calories. And the second reason is, of course, toxicity. Many mushrooms will literally poison you, and some will give you a real good buzz. But don't attempt to eat mushrooms, no matter what the circumstances are. Even if you know they're edible, the calorie return it just isn't worth it. It just isn't worth it. So, stay away from that stuff. Find yourself something you can bend into a hook and go fishing if you have to, or step into a stream and turn over a few rocks and look for some crawfish, or look for some crustaceans that'll get you through if you have to. But, mushrooms, not a good idea, especially if they have a hallucinogenic, because that's not going to get you through the night. That's going to send you off into la-la land, and you're going to head in way wrong direction for sure. I tell you what, if this is okay with you, Richard, we would be normally ending in 9 minutes, but I'd like to hold you over and we'll go to the top of the hour, only because we have a few phone calls holding up on the line, and we've been going a little long here. So I tell you what we're going to do. We'll take, we'll just keep going. I have on the line a young fellow by the name of Steve, and Steve, I'm going to bring you up on the line here, and you have a statement or questions for Richard regarding survival?
Yes, I do. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, Richard, for a very informative broadcast for sure. Preparedness is key in survival, and anyone who's listening to this broadcast tonight should certainly take this to heed, because I've actually, lived in California a good part of my life since I was about 6 years old, and I've experienced several earthquakes. But I think it was in 1994. I was about 2.5 miles from the epicenter of the Northridge earthquake, and about 4:20 in the morning, that thing literally rocked me out of bed, and I thought it was the end of the world. I had food in the house. I had canned goods, food for my dogs, some dried goods. But what happened was there was no electricity, there was no phone, no water, and I did have a portable radio, always kept flashlights, candles, matches, lighters, reading material, puzzles, but I needed water. I didn't stock up with water because I took it for granted, like most people do. They go through their life thinking, yeah, I'll just turn on the tap water, just go down to fast food, go down to the store, everything's going to be great. Well, what I realized, it was an eye-opener, that there was no water, and luckily there was a supermarket probably about 3 blocks away. When I walked over there, I thought I was in Disneyland, because the line coming out of the market was as long as one of the most popular rides there. And everybody, of course, was waiting for water, for gallons of plastic jugs of water. And, of course, they were selling them for like $5, $6 a jug. And I bought a few. And from that day on, I always, made sure that this would never happen again. Now, luckily, it was only about 3 days without the power, without the water, and they got things back to normal. So what I do now is I make sure, that I have my water. I rotate the water because, you can't keep it forever. My dog has food. I've got canned goods. There's a store that sells a lot of bulk items, so I stock up on sunflower seeds, granola. You were talking earlier about, beans and rice and things that will last, have a good shelf life. Of course, medical supplies. And, I've got a couple questions and a couple comments. You mentioned about, when you go out camping, you definitely want to make sure someone knows about it. It brings to mind the movie 127 Hours, where this guy was an experienced hiker, and he made like 12 ounces of water last 127 hours. If you've seen the movie, he wanted to guzzle the whole thing down, but he knew he couldn't or he would have died. Unfortunately, he didn't tell anybody where he was going, so that's an excellent point. You have to do that. I am leading to a question, so bear with me. A couple of things. Okay, first of all, you touched on, and bear with me because I tuned in about 20 minutes late, but so there may be things you've already touched on. But outside of the home and besides camping, if you're in your car and let's say you're in the city and you're driving, from work and from work to your home is 20 miles and everything goes topsy-turvy, in your trunk, you better have some good hiking boots because your dress shoes aren't going to cut it. You better have basically what you have at home, some water, blankets, jackets, gloves, medical supplies. So always keep, flashlights, everything. You keep that in your car trunk as well because you never know where and when something like this could happen. The thing I wanted to ask you, Richard, was this. I live in the desert. You also talked about that with Colin. And, I've grown some, a couple of years ago, I planted an apricot tree, and amazingly, it produces a plentiful amount of apricots only 1 month a year, May. The orange trees aren't doing so good. I planted peppers, I planted tomatoes, and they did yield a nice crop for like one season, then they all kind of died out. My soil is pretty much clay and bedrock. It's hard. I've cultivated as much as I can. My question is a couple things. First of all, tell me what, and your listeners, what are these survival seeds, and what's the difference between the survival seeds and just ordinary seeds? How are they more beneficial? And also, let's say, you stock up on food, you stock up on water, you're good to go, and okay, so it's an earthquake and you get by it, in 3 days, a week, whatever. But long term, where all of your food supplies run out, it reminds me of that movie, The Road, where they turn to cannibalism, and God forbid that happens, because you can do these survival seeds keep yielding, season after season, and so that you'll always have food for it until things hopefully get back to normal. And basically, because once your food supply is gone, it's going to run out eventually if you can't get food at your local stores. What do you do? What, is it just a worst case scenario, doomsday, or what can we do?
Okay, well, that's two good questions. So let me start with the survival seeds. So what those are they're non-genetically modified seeds and non-hybrid seeds. So what happens is, basically, they call them heirloom. So that means those are plants that will produce a seed that will grow true from seed. In other words, if you make a tomato from an heirloom seed, it will produce tomatoes, and the seeds in that tomato will produce more tomatoes. Unfortunately, a lot of companies like Monsanto have produced these either genetically modified or hybrid seeds that produce a plant that doesn't have the ability to reproduce. So they're a one-season only crop. And you can see if you're a company that makes and sells seeds, it's to your advantage if you want to keep making money to make seeds that don't continue to produce plants. So that's what they are. They're plants that have been modified through not only gene modification, but also through selective breeding to where they just won't continue to produce after the first season. So these survivalist seeds are heirloom seeds. So you want to have them, and there have actually been some laws that want to place that want to govern the purchase of heirloom seeds, for this particular reason. Unfortunately, in the state that we have, the lobbyists write the laws, so You know, they're just out to protect their profits. So that's the story behind the survivalist seed. As far as long term, yes, you want to have the ability to have a garden, so with these heirloom seeds, so that you can continue to produce. The other thing is to learn, if you can, to live off the land a little bit. In other words, if you look back at some of the more primitive societies, we call them primitive, whether it be, you know, Native Americans or these, you know, Ice Age men that lived in Europe, they saw the surrounding wilderness as a supermarket. There's a post, it's probably in the archive section of my site, that covers like an introduction into wild edibles. You need to be careful with edibles because a lot of foods in the wild are poisonous. As a matter of fact, about 60% of all plants contain some, at least, poisonous parts. You've got to be real careful with identification. But if you can start out, learn 5, 10 plants that are very common in your area, that you commonly recognize, especially things that you would recognize, like, you know, nuts, pecans, walnuts. Everybody knows what an acorn looks like. These sorts of ways. Learn what they are. Learn to prepare them. Begin to experiment. Then you can see that long-term survival. We know historically that human beings have sustained themselves for thousands of years off of large percentages of nuts like acorns. Acorns are a staple food. They're easy to identify. They produce a lot of food. There's a small preparation before you eat them. They have a lot of tannic acid, so you have to leach out the tannic acid. You do that by a process called parboiling. So, in other words, you boil the nuts once you peel the shell away, and you change the water till they get a good, clean, taste, and the harshness of that tannic acid is gone. But we're going to have to. So you've got to get these staple starches like nuts, and then and tubers and things like that you can easily identify. Add in some leafy greens that are easy to identify, and then hopefully if you can hunt or catch some wild game, begin to get back into that sort of agricultural and animal husbandry mindset where you begin to keep animals and let them produce. So I don't think that we will lose the ability to produce and procure food. We just have to know what we're doing, and we have to get that knowledge and pass it down to the next generation.
And as far as identifying, toxic plants, I guess to put into your survival kit would not be a bad idea to obtain a book that will show you what's good and what's bad.
What you want is, you want something like what's called a field guide. There are several field guides, and the field guides give you photos, descriptions. You have to be extremely careful. So what you want to do, and this is what I write about, is you want to identify plants to start with that do not have what's called a poison twin. So in wild edibles, a poison twin is a plant that looks a whole lot like an edible plant, but it's not edible. It's very, very close. I'll talk about like Queen Anne's lace, which is a wild carrot. There's several people that have been killed eating this because it looks exactly like a wild carrot. The difference is if you look at the flower, there's a large white flower, and on the Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot, there's a red dot in the middle of the flower. On the poison hemlock, there's not a red dot, and there are a few other subtle differences. But if you hold the two plants together, if you're novice, they look very similar. And there have been even a lot of survival experts that have died from eating poison hemlock when they thought it was wild carrots. So you've got to be extremely careful. You've got to know that you've got positive identification. And unfortunately, there are not a lot of hard and fast rules. There are a few rules when it comes to identifying plants, but not many. You really have to know and identify each plant. And you have to know that it's edible.
Yeah, and what's amazing is that it's almost nature's way of telling you, even though it might be a very little subtle, insignificant detail, but it's nature's way of saying, hey, this is the bad one.
Yeah,
exactly, and that's a good point. So purchase a field guide. That's probably about the best way. Or take time when you're surfing the Internet and go look for field guides and information on the Internet. Become proactive. Don't be reactive. Once it hits the fan, you don't have time to go knocking on the bookstore door and saying, do you have a field guide? You know, you need to get ahead of this. One question coming out of the virtual studio, Richard, in a bug-out situation, what is the best way to filter water? Now, assuming that the water, you don't have purification tablets, you said sand would be a good way of doing it, or charcoal, correct?
Sand and charcoal. So what you want to do is find some cylindrical, vessel, whether it be, a Coke bottle or something like that, larger is better. And you want to filter that water in a couple of layers. So the first thing that you want to do is you want to strain that water coming in through a cloth like a T-shirt so that you catch all those large particles. And then you want to have several layers of sand and charcoal, a few inches thick. So the sand filters out the larger particles, and the charcoal with those microscopic holes that it has catches all the fine particles and bacteria, those sorts of things. And then you filter that through several layers. And then if you can boil it, better. If not, in most cases, it's safe. Another step that you can do is ultraviolet light will also purify water. So if you can strain your water, then put it in a clear plastic bottle and expose it to sunlight for about an hour, the ultraviolet light will also kill bacteria. So if you can't boil it, you should at least expose it to sunlight for about an hour.
Richard, when you're saying strain it, what type of material, like a cheesecloth or something? I mean, when you're straining the water through the charcoal, I didn't quite get that.
So what you would do is you would say you had a Coke bottle or something, okay. And you would keep the cap on it, and you would poke a small hole in the cap, and then turn it over and cut the flat part of the bottom off, plastic bottle. And then, starting there, you could put a little bit of charcoal at the bottom, and then a couple of inches of sand, and then a few inches of charcoal, and then a few inches of sand till you get at the bottom. Then wrap the top of that in a shirt or some sort of a cloth, so that when you pour the water in, it's just like a coffee filter. It catches all the solids. And then that water filters down through the bottle, and then you will try to catch it in another bottle. Then when you have that purified water in the second bottle, then you can leave it exposed to sunlight for about an hour and let the ultraviolet light continue to purify that. And after about an hour exposed to sunlight, that water is safe to drink. Of course, it's best to boil if you can, but the ultraviolet light will also purify it.
Very good. Richard, what is your website?
The website is www.centraltexassurvival.com, and there should be a link there on the Blog Talk Radio page.
Yes, there is, and there's also a link down in the virtual studio, Steve, and we will be doing some follow-up with centraltexassurvival.com and some links through Radio. Probably be up by tomorrow morning with a quick recap of tonight's show. Anything else you'd like to ask Richard, Steve, while you're still on the line?
No, I answered all my questions, and I just wanted to say that, again, this format is great because, there's so much information coming out in a short span of time, 3 hours. But what I like about this is that you can go back later in the night or the next day and listen to the broadcast again and pick up things that you didn't, hear the first time, or if you missed it for 20 minutes like I did. So, again, just kudos to you, Colin, and the Night Zone Radio, Radio, and all your guests. They're very informative. I just really appreciate it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate your time, Steve. And Richard, as we head into the final 20 minutes, there's so much information to get out there. It's next to impossible to be able to cover everything. But I think it's important that people realize that there are websites out there for anybody that's looking for information on survivalists. Go check Richard's site, centraltexassurvival.com, but also just go look at ehow.com. Some great information up there for the information that you need to survive. Now, Richard, we've covered the household survival. We've covered the wilderness survival. How about these the theory of jump kits or the bug out kits? Now, obviously, you're going to have to travel a little lighter than you would if you were sat at home with all of these supplies. So the basic necessities, again, would be the first aid kit, obviously. That would be right at the top of the list, I would think.
Yeah, so, you want first aid. You want a little bit of water. You want a means to produce fire. You want a means to signal for rescue. You want an emergency blanket, so some way to keep warm, a rope, those sorts of things. Something else, too, just to talk about this, there are really two types of, there's bug-out bags, if you will. You have a bug-out, which means, you're at your house, things are bad, and you need to go somewhere else, you bug out. And then there's a concept of something that's called a bug-back bag, which means you're out and about, you're at work, you're trying to get home where your supplies are. And so they're basically the same, but different in the sense that one is the supplies that you need to get home where the rest of your supplies are, knowing that you may or may not make it, and the other one that says, well, everything has hit the fan, we've got to go somewhere else. So if you're bugging back, like you said, it's going to be lightweight. It's probably just a backpack, something that can be kept in the car to get home those few miles. If you're actually bugging out, you're planning on traveling for probably several days or weeks to get to a place that is sustainable for long-term survival. So a bug-out bag is going to be larger. It's several days of food. It's several days' worth of water. It's perhaps, if you have it and have room for it, it's a tent rather than just making a shelter every night. Something else I want to talk about, like these bug-back scenarios and bags. The gentleman that called earlier talked about having emergency supplies in the car, needing to get home. If you take the same route home from work every day, the route that you take in a vehicle may not be the same that you take on foot. So you need to plan this route ahead. You need to know which route you're going to take. You need to know where the sources of water are along the way. You need to know where it's safe to hide out if you need to. You need to let your family know the route that you've planned to take. Myself, I have a route that I've planned from my place of work to my home. My wife knows the route that I'm going to take. So if for some reason I'm stranded, but she has a vehicle that works, if she chooses to come after me or whatever, I'm on the route that we've pre-planned. So really, this is all about planning ahead and practicing. That's the thing. Like in the military, what you do is you get together and you practice the same thing over and over and over and over again, and then you do the same thing over and over and over and over again until it becomes second nature. And that's what you want. Is if you're in that survival situation, you don't want to panic. You want to say, okay, I've practiced this. I've got my kid. I know my route. Get on the road. I'm going to stop at this place and fill up on some water when I run out. You want to have that plan ahead of time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. The idea of, well, I'll get to that bridge. I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. A cataclysmic event could happen in a blink of an eye. It doesn't have to be warned by the government. It may not be seen as coming. It just happened. And when those events happen, you have to be prepared. It's a Baden-Powell theory. You have to be prepared for anything that could possibly happen, because it most probably will. It's not a matter of if, as we said at the beginning of the show. It's a matter of when you are going to need your emergency management skills. And planning it and having your family understand the plan, even if it's only a matter of a kitchen fire or a fire in the house. How do you get out of the house? Where are your exit points? Where will you muster so you know everybody is safe? How do you do this? And people, unfortunately, Richard, in today's society, we live on the Internet. We anticipate all of the bells and whistles of our life to be running when we need them. And when they are not, what do you do? And I think that's where we are tonight, Richard. And I believe me, I am truly grateful for tonight's show, because there are millions, if not billions, of people out there not expecting to have to go into an emergency status. And when you do go into the emergency status, there has to be a core amount of people that are prepared to respond and have the ability to respond, especially regarding first aid. There's going to be injuries. There's going to be sickness. And yes, there is going to be death. And you have to be able to deal with these issues. And Richard, I've been through your website. I think I've raked and pillaged it over the last couple of weeks. And the information that I've got from there, I've got to tell you, it's absolutely amazing. And Richard, I just received a quick text from the American Red Cross. And they have given me a list of what's required in a first aid kit, and I'm just going to bang through it as quickly as possible. It seems to me you'd need a pickup truck to move all of this, but they say each first aid kit should include various size bandages, sterile dressing, a conforming roller gauze bandage, 2 triangle bandages, 2 3x3 sterile gauze pads, 2 4x4 sterile gauze pads, a roll of 3-inch cohesive bandage, germicidal hand wipes or sanitizer, antiseptic wipes, large medical non-latex gloves, adhesive tape, antibacterial ointment, a cold pack, scissors, and tweezers. It is also a good idea to pack a space blanket, emergency knife, and waterproof matches, especially if these are in your vehicle. Now, on your website, you mentioned something that I use absolutely every day, in fact 3 or 4 times a day, and that's hand sanitizer.
Yes.
As a starting tool for matches to get a fire going.
Yeah, so hand sanitizer is very flammable. You know, the warning says don't smoke and within a few minutes of cleaning your hands. But that's one thing is in high wind conditions, it's not always that easy to start a fire with a single match. As a matter of fact, certain people with no experience can go through an entire book of matches and never start a fire. Wood is combustible, but it requires a certain amount of heat. You have to get it up to a flash point. So the alcohol in the hand sanitizer is very flammable, and that gel kind of helps to keep it from evaporating. So if you've got some, if you can put it out and rub a little bit on some of your kindling, get it in a pile, just the smallest amount of flame will get that started, and that will help you get that first little bit of coals that will make sure that your fire lives and grows.
As we look at the jump kits, we've looked at the vehicle emergency kits and the first aid, and we've looked at the survival in the wilderness. Now, this is presuming that all services have ended, and that is a very real possibility, as it happened in New Orleans. For, I think, 4 days, there was absolutely no services available. Now, given that, are there other methods of survival that don't get into the survival guides that you have learned in hunting that you could share with our audience?
Well, of course, a lot of people talk about hunting and trapping. Of course, that's as a hobby, I hunt game, and in Texas, the big prize is white-tailed deer. So you need a hunting rifle if you're going to hunt with for game with a rifle, or if you can't have a gun, if you can have a bow and an arrow. A lot of people can hunt with bow and arrow. Of course, you have to be a lot closer to the game, because they get spooked. So if you're going to hunt with a rifle, it gives you a lot more distance. But you have to have ammunition too. A lot of people hunt, keep a rifle, and don't keep but 20 rounds of ammunition. You've got to have enough to get yourself through that. Through whatever time it is. If it's long term, you've got to come up with other methods. Primitive hunters have hunted with bow and arrow, with spear, but predominantly what you'll find if you look throughout history, even though we call our ancestors hunter-gatherers, they were really more trappers and gatherers. They got their game, their large game, with baited pit traps. So they would dig a hole and they would put some food down there that would draw the animal. They would cover that pit with small sticks and leaves, and then of course when the animal came along to get the food, they'd fall in the pit. So that's a common method of hunting because it's efficient. In other words, that pit for large game is working while you're off doing other things, while you're gardening. So trapping is really a more efficient means of gathering food long term. That's what our ancestors did. They were far more trappers than they were actual hunters.
Right. And are there any fish in our streams and rivers and ponds that are poisonous that you know of, or is it all fair game to eat?
Yeah, as far as I know, there are no poisonous freshwater fish. There are poisonous saltwater fish, but as far as I know, there are no poisonous freshwater fish. Of course, even with the saltwater, you should avoid, like with fish, you want to avoid the liver and things like that. Stick to the meat itself. Avoid the organ meat in fish, particularly because a lot of our streams are polluted. They're starting to find things like caffeine and Valium and things like that in our fish and streams, and especially they collect the the liver and the other organs. So you want to avoid that. Of course, cook your food.
Right. Richard, this has been an absolutely fabulous 2 hours. I can't believe we've blown through it already. Sir, you're a wealth of knowledge, and I invite all of our guests, current and the future archives, to go to centraltexassurvival.com, check out your information, make contact with you, and I'm sure there's thousands of more questions out there we could ask, and this will be an ongoing situation, and I hope at another time that we can meet up again and have another show like this, sir.
Sure, anytime.
Anytime at all. You just let me know if you have something you wish to tell. But tell me, before you disappear, tell me about these cargo containers.
Oh, the shipping containers. So
yeah.
A lot of people have the plan that if they're going to bug out, as we talked about, they've got some place to go, rural property, something like that. And shipping containers, these metal boxes that we use to ship goods back and forth to China and stuff like that. They're metal, essentially not rust-proof, but very rust-resistant steel boxes. And you can lock them and store food in there. And they're also good for form, for if you want to bury them underground. They require a little bit of engineering. You can look into it and, you know, encase them in concrete or cover them with earth, whatever you want to do. Again, it requires a little bit of engineering. I have several myself. They're very good. They're modular. They're an instant structure. That's why you're starting to see them crop up in home building and in apartment building, because you can buy these cargo containers. They're also called connexes very cheaply. You can have them delivered to your land. They become an instant building shelter that's lockable. You can store your food if you want to store it in a bug-out location. And again, you can bury them if you need to. And they're a very quick and efficient and cheap way to get something up quick.
Right. Good idea. Richard, thank you very much for your time, sir. And as I said before, anytime you let me know, and we'll schedule a show on survival, because it is very, very important. Thank you for your time tonight, sir.
And thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Scroggins from centraltexassurvival.com. Check out his website, because it is amazing. And just quickly, we're going to go through a quick list here. If you're at home, basic stores that you need for a week: 7 gallons of bottled water per person or pet. That's a gallon a day. That's enough for a week. Water purification tablets for extra emergency water supplies. Food for a week, which doesn't need water to heat or prepare. Don't forget the pet food. First aid kit, prescriptions, non-prescription medications, a manual can opener, flashlights with fresh batteries, battery-powered lanterns. Try and avoid candles. It consumes oxygen. Battery-powered radio or hand crank radio, fresh batteries, lighters or matches. Water and gas supply. Keep them next to the valves. You might need them. Disposable cups, plates, utensils to conserve water. Stay away from candles. Emergency services may not be available to respond to fires. Don't use indoor grills. You could give everyone carbon monoxide poisoning. Know how to treat your water supply, emergency water supply, for extended periods. You know, if you can stay away from batteries, that's good. Use hand crank radios, as I said earlier. It has been an absolute pleasure. I can't believe we blew through 2 hours. And we are running tonight on a survival approach with Mr. Richard Scroggins from centraltexassurvival.com. Now, if you get the opportunity to go to Richard's site, have a look around. There's lots of great information, especially the information on the back pages or the archives. Have a look around. There's some great stuff up there. Good evening, Richard. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. How are you, Colin?
I'm excellent, sir. Thank you very much. I do appreciate you taking the time to come to us tonight. Richard, let's start by giving our listeners a little bit of your background. How did you come by all of these survival skills that you put up on your website?
Well, like I say on the website, it really started out as something I learned from my dad. My dad had been in the Army, and he had been stationed in Korea, and he wanted his sons to have the knowledge and ability to survive if something happened. And he was fond of saying when I was a kid that we needed to be prepared, because one day we might be in the middle of the woods, get lost, and might need to be able to find our way out. So that got me started. And then I spent a few years in the military with with the what's called an AFSC in the Air Force of emergency management, specifically dealing with hurricanes and evacuation.
Mm-hmm.
Additionally, my grandfather was also a minister, and he studied prophecy and was interested very much in the end times and Revelation, and that got my interest piqued in end time study, and I sort of married the two throughout my life. And when I was doing research into survival early on, I found that there are a lot of people that talk about wilderness survival, and there are a lot of people that talk about end times, but you don't find too many people that marry the two, and that was sort of a gap for me, and that's why I started the website. But I've had a lot of experience. I was going to say,
are you still there?
In addition, yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, so we just got to bounce on the link there, but go ahead, sir.
Okay. And then as well, I also worked for several years for an electric utility. So I had a lot of experience with grid, so that's why I also talk a lot on the website about grid failures, the state of the grid, power, backup issues, and things like that.
Well, I'm most certainly pleased that you have that information under your belt, Richard. So accepting the premise that a disaster or a catastrophe is not an if, but a when, and kind of using the Katrina and New Orleans as a model of failure, we're aware the electrical grid system in North America is strained at best, and a number of issues could bring it down, as we saw a few years ago on the eastern seaboard. What immediate dangers do you see on the horizon regarding the electrical grid that would necessitate being prepared to lose power?
Well, it's not just theoretical. As a matter of fact, with the storm that just went through here in Texas, we had several days of mandatory rolling blackouts, especially in the big cities. I wrote an article about this. What's happened over the last few years in terms of the electrical grid is as we begin to rely more on technology, something that's called a SCADA system. It's an automated control system. We have begun to phase out some of the old manual switching equipment. And so what happens is if you have power failures that are large enough, everything relies on computer systems to control them. And in many cases, the reliance on computer systems is so heavy that the actual physical switches to reroute power no longer exist. And then you couple that with the fact that many power plants are getting rid of their small generators that are called black start generators. So we have very few black start power plants, and I'll explain that a little bit. What a black start is if you can think about it, it takes electricity to make electricity. So if you have a power plant, or say the entire grid goes down and you want to start the power up from the beginning, there's no power out there. You have to have some form of generation to get the first power plant started, and they have to be isolated from the rest of the grid. And once they're brought up, then you can begin to reconnect them to other power plants to bring them online. And these black start generators are not something that you just go down to Home Depot and buy. They're very large propane or natural gas powered generators. So over the last few decades, especially in Texas and throughout the country, we've begun to phase out these black start generators and power plants that have the ability to black start. So we found ourselves in a situation that if we were to lose any particular grid, there's a tremendous amount of time that it will take to bring the power back online. One, because there are very few black start generating plants, and also because of the reliance on these computer control systems, these SCADA control systems. A lot of the manual switching that needs to be done to isolate the black start power plants and also to reconnect the grid will have to be done manually. And these crews could be in who knows what conditions, whether it be snow or rain or flooding, so it will greatly increase the time it would take to get the power back on.
Mm-hmm. And not necessarily the grid would come alive. It would take, we're not talking just turning a switch and everything comes back on. This could be days, weeks, even months before they could get enough of the grid up to sustain itself. Am I correct?
Well, yes, you are. And the reason is, again, because if the entire grid goes down, then you have to begin to first isolate the power plants that have the ability to black start. And then once they're up and running, then you can begin to interlink those power plants with other power plants. And then once all the power plants are powered up and running, then you can begin to give power back to the people, as it were, as you begin to build up the power on the grid.
Right, right. Now, you mentioned, you briefly mentioned that we are technologically driven now, computer-driven, if you will. And we have seen those stories over the last 6-7 months where people have actually got into the grid and hacked the grid and left little love notes and such. Is that a huge threat, or are they beginning to protect the grid against stuff like that?
Well, they're protecting it as best as they can, and there are rules in place, particularly in Texas. But it does happen. I've seen it firsthand. I work at a utility in Texas that I won't name, and we did have our SCADA system hacked. So it does happen, and it can happen.
And of course, we saw up in Quebec, Canada, the winter storm that came through Quebec 2 years ago, literally knocked out the Quebec grid, which of course kicked down the line and bumped out New York, and it just kept going until almost hemorrhaged, until somebody found a way of stopping it affecting the Midwest. But we had a potential at that point in time of the whole grid collapsing from a winter storm, from ice on the major power cables. It was terrifying.
Yeah, it is. I remember that. And
yeah,
it's one of those things to where, we don't think that it can happen, but it happens on a small scale quite often.
Yeah, yeah. And that's the problem, is that we are not hearing all of what is happening. We hear the majors, but we do not hear the the daily incursions onto our grid system, which is, it is very pervasive. They have identified a number of countries that have been testing whether they can actually get into the system and manipulate it. And that's quite concerning, because if a terrorist ever did get onto our electrical system, they could shut us down in a matter of minutes.
Yes, they could.
Yeah, and of course that doesn't cover anything like earthquakes, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, winter storms, and of course Apophis, this 390-meter wide asteroid that's going to make a close flyby in April 2013. Nobody has guaranteed that the gravitational pulls of this asteroid or its turbitude is not going to affect us, and we have seen over the last year the changes of the weather patterns, which is absolutely insane. Nobody can really judge what's going to happen tomorrow. And the electrical grid does seem to be the weak point of our system. We are so stuck with the system. Without electricity, can you imagine what North America would be like? What don't we use that involves electricity anymore? It's insane, even down to our toothbrushes, for goodness sake.
Well, our entire society revolves around electricity. We need it. It's identified in terms of, I can remember when we were doing the disaster recovery planning after 9/11, the U.S. government began to prioritize all of the utilities. And of course, electricity was the number one priority. We don't think about this. In other words, we have electricity and we take it for granted. And we don't think about everything that it impacts. And in other words, you think about it, your car runs on gasoline, but you can't run the pumps to pump the gasoline if you don't have electricity.
Exactly.
And if you can't pump the gas, you can't run the trucks that deliver food. And given the fact that the average store only keeps about 3 days worth of food, if you can't bring in new supplies, pretty soon the stores run out of food. So very quickly, it can devolve.
Yeah, they run out of, they do.
Yeah, I was going to say there's a common saying among survivalists and in the community is that we're essentially 9 meals away from anarchy, and that comes from the fact that the stores only keep about 3 days worth of food, and when that runs out, if there's no resupply, there's no more food.
And also take into account that many of these stores are storing whatever supplies they do have in massive cooling fridges and refrigerators, and of course without electricity. There's a show on the History Channel up here in Canada, Earth After Man or something of that nature, where it shows where man no longer exists, there's no power, and it shows you how fast the supermarkets and the food stores, how fast the food rots. And funnily enough, the only thing that survives for about 50 years are Twinkies. So anybody out there that likes Twinkies, it's always something to stock up on, because even though they have probably 0 calories or 0 nutrition, Twinkies will last 50 years apparently. So, you know, a Twinkie will be the only thing left on Earth, and that's kind of a scary thing. I was watching Fox News and also NASA the other night, and they showed the Temple 1 asteroid. This thing is 3.7 miles wide, 6 kilometers. It has an orbital period of 5.5 years around our solar system. It's made one trip around the sun since the deep impact visit in 2004. And it's coming back, and they just sat a camera on that about 100 kilometers away overnight and took some photographs of Temple, and also of the Apophis, and absolutely fantastic to see what they're doing. But my gut instinct tells me they're testing for something that's incoming at a later date, possibly Planet X, Nibiru. But I can't see them going into that far deeper space if they don't think something is on the way in.
Well, I would tend to agree. And that's why, you know, from the standpoint of a survivalist, to me, regardless of what the threat is, the preparation is essentially the same. And something I wanted to say, to revisit what we were talking about, you talked about Katrina earlier. When Hurricane Ike hit Texas, I know that wasn't the same scale as Katrina. It was pretty devastating for this area. And I was with the National Guard team that went into Ike after the aftermath. I was down there for about 3 weeks in Galveston, and